Hi parents, my name is Tammy Muller. I was your kids' Bible teacher for the week and so blessed to be that. I've heard from so many staff here and I concur that this group was an amazing group. They were so open, so willing to engage, had great questions, wanted to learn. We fell in love with them. So what we want to do is we don't want to stop now. We want to make sure you are equipped to have continual conversations with your kids based on what we talked about this week when they get home. So I'm just going to take you briefly through what we talked about this week. Day 1, Monday, they got here. We talked about all the world religions, and there's about 4,200 in the world. The one thing they left with is you don't need to know what each religion believes, but you need to know the difference. Every other religion in the world says do. You're saved by what you do. If you say Jesus and anything, baptism and confession and anything, that's not Christianity. Christianity, the only thing we know about Christianity is it's done. So every other religion do and Christianity done. And that's the one big thing we have to remember. That and the fact that every other religion says Jesus was a good teacher. He was a prophet. Christianity says Jesus is God, and he has to be because every sin is against God. So only God can forgive those sins. Day 2, we talked about the gospel. And we had a skit with a son who was speeding and he had to come in front of the courtroom where the judge was his dad. The penalty for the amount of speeding he did was death. We stopped the skit and I said to the kids, what would a good judge have to do if he was a good judge? And they said they'd have to make him guilty. What would a good father have to do? Because it's his father. And they said he'd have to let him off. I said, well, how is this judge going to put those two things together and still be a good judge and a good father? And they agreed that the only thing that judge could do was to come off the bench, take the penalty on himself, which means the penalty was still given, good judge, and the son was allowed to live, good father. And so we talked about the fact, and I used this illustration, but we talked about the fact that this is God, this is sin, and this is us, and we're separated from God by our sin, and we can try to clean it up, but that doesn't work. We can try to cover it up, but that doesn't work. We can make excuses for it, we can compare it to somebody else's, but it still remains. And the only thing that actually removes that, and it's kind of a little tricky thing here, but the cross kind of goes in here. Well, here, I'm going to hand that back to you. There's a hook on the bottom of it, but it pulls that sin out. And once the sin is actually gone, then we can commune with God. But until that time, and that sin is in between there, you can't be near God. It separates you. We have to get rid of the sin. Jesus is the only thing that does that. So then on, day 3, we talked about the fact that the treasure doesn't end there. Salvation is the biggest part of that treasure, but once you're saved, the treasure, because God is so generous, keeps going and going and going. And so that treasure really is to know God. We have a tendency to say, hey, God loves me, God loves you, and we think that's the crux of Christianity. But really, that's an incomplete statement. God loves you so that you can proclaim his glory to everyone. It's still about him. He's the treasure. So to know God is the second part of that treasure. And then power over sin is another part of that treasure that he gives us. And self-worth that comes, if you could buy a book, it's Max Licado's book about Punchinello. Buy that book. The kids loved it, and it talks about really how you get your worth, and it's through what he believes about you, not what the world believes. And then we also talked about someone who can take your burdens. That's another portion of that treasure. But those portions of treasure are really available to only people who are his children. And so we have to handle the first part, which is salvation. Last night, Thursday night, we talked about Samson and setting up false idols. To make it really simple, go through the story of Samson in Judges 14 through 16 with your child right away when they get home and see what they remember. They're going to remember a lot because it was engaging. We used this head. It had long locks on it because we cut them off. If you get to Judges 16, you'll see why. And there's no eyes because they gouged out Samson's eyes. So these are all just little Velcro things that we stuck on, and we changed his expression. It was awesome. It totally brought the point home for them. But when it comes to setting up false idols, the kids left with this one thing. If you're acting according to your feelings, then you're technically setting up an idol of self. So Samson set up an idol of lust and power or pride and rage, anger, and those things were an indicator that he was setting up an idol of himself. Tonight, we're going to be talking about evangelism. What do you do? How do you tell people about who God is? And the one thing you have to start with is you've got to start with the verse that talks about doing it with gentleness and respect. And so that is really it. You got to start with friendship first, but you have to deliver truth. It's not enough just to be friends. We've got to tell people the truth. The bad news before the good news. Yes, Jesus can be there to satisfy all your desires, but he's got to save you first. And so that's the bad news. You need a rescuer. But once that happens, he'll deliver the goods on satisfying everything else. That's it, parents. It was an amazing week. I hope that gives you lots of little chunks to go back and talk to your campers about. Do not let them come home and not just follow up with conversation, because the more you talk about it, the more they're going to remember it. And we want them to remember. They were a blessing. I cannot wait to see them back here next year.